Happy Friday, everyone. It's actually kind of chilly here today, but I've got a cup of hot tea and I'm hoping this is going to be a nice transition to a calm and cozy weekend. As we wrap up our week on governing councils, I can't think of a more appropriate time to come back to Plato, who is someone who thought long and hard about oligarchic governments, about the benefits of equality and distributing power versus the risks of tyrants and aristocrats putting their own interests above those of their city. And so, as we close out this week on wondering whether or not we should replace a direct democracy in Athens with a governing council, maybe something like Sparta has, it's really a perfect time to turn to Plato and one of his last, perhaps his very last work that he ever wrote, in order to think about how he is communicating through time to teach us about what is required to create a perfect society. Now, perhaps somewhat ironically, I've named today with a hint at the futility of creating a perfect society. I've called it today's lecture, No Perfect World, Plato, Lykurgan, and the Dream of a Perfect Oligarchy. And the reason I've given it this title is because I don't think that anyone's life illustrates more beautifully than Plato's just how hard it can be to realize even the most noble of dreams, right? That someone like Plato had devoted his entire life to continuing the mission of Socrates and his education, of trying to think through the challenges in creating a system that delivers justice and fairness and nobility of spirit, and yet how in his own personal life and through his lived experience, how Plato often found those dreams crumbled. So I don't know, today's not a depressing day, but I think it will either lead us to look at Plato as something of a dreamer whose dreams couldn't be achieved, or maybe the first step in many that would be required in order to fulfill the idea of good governance. Okay, you ready to get started? Today I'll be using mostly the texts that we read, so I don't know that you're going to need to pause much. I'm of two minds about whether you should watch this first or read the readings first. Totally up to you, but if you haven't started the readings yet, that's perfectly fine. I'll try to offer a little bit of context and introduction, and then when you go back to them, hopefully they'll make a lot more sense than you did the first read through. All right, okay, let's get started. So I want to kick us off by reminding you that this entire week has been pitting the opposition between a direct democracy like Athens has versus a governing council like Sparta has. At the top of this week, I noted that Athens actually once did, in the archaic Athens, have a strong governing council, the Areopagus. And then last class for Wednesday, I talked about just how efficient the Spartan governing council was at identifying potential threats, individuals who might become tyrannical, and expelling them from the city, either through exile or, in the case of Pausanias, execution, if they thought that that threat would truly emerge and overturn Spartan society. And we even see that by the time we got to the boy king Cleisthenes and Lysander, they were willing to do so even when the evidence of corruption was very, very thin. That's how seriously Sparta took tyrannical threats. Now, I had a nice time reading over some of your answers to the discussion boards, and I wanted to share a few of them because one of the core questions I asked you is really, which is worse? Is it more dangerous to have an oligarchic council that could put its own interests above those of other people in the city? Or is a populist individual more dangerous? Someone kind of like Lysander, who had broad support among the Spartans and other vast resources to further his cause. And I've managed to pluck out two of your responses here. The first one is by Shreya Rana in my second section. And I think here Shreya illustrates a viewpoint that came through in many of your responses, that populist leaders pose a greater threat to society over a long period of time, and that there really isn't anybody there to make sure they aren't going overboard. Even if they propose a horrible law, the people will trust him enough to make the law go through. And I think that Shreya's comment here shows us that if a person can get the people on their side, even if that person has really ill intent, that mission could be carried through because of their personal popularity. Davis Caron, in my first section, you actually made an interesting comparison to the way Hitler made a power grab, right? By gaining enough support and popularity among the German people that as he continued to pass more terrible laws, they went unpunished. I also, though, thought that Zach raised a good point. He was one of the few voices in my first section who cited oligarchy as a more dangerous option. It really has no benefits, he says, unless you're one of the oligarchs. And a prime example of that is the government of the 30 tyrants. Even a populist leader like Pericles may not have been a good leader, but ultimately the power of an oligarchic force that puts themselves above the people, as Zach sees it, presents itself as more dangerous. Now, last class, I emphasized that what the Spartan government shows us, and even what the archaic Athenian Areopagus shows us, is that an oligarchic council can sometimes be the one check on growing tyrants like Chilon, like Pausanias, and like Lysander. And this need to nip in the bud a dangerous individual is really the one stopgap that Athens doesn't seem to have. It's what allows people like Pericles to rise to power, and then eventually Cleon, and then Alcibiades, and then potentially even Thrasybulus. There's no hint that Thrasybulus becomes tyrannical, but we could very easily see how someone who had just defeated the 30 tyrants, had slaves and medics on their sides, could harness that power for their own personal gain. And I think Walter brings this up very clearly in his response. People can easily be manipulated into thinking a leader is a great leader, which is why populists are so dangerous. The checks and balances between oligarchs, no matter the monetary advantages they have, can keep people in check. So if nothing else, at least oligarchs, as Walter points out, at least oligarchs can be checks on each other. And if any one of them in their group begins to rise too much, the group will pull them back down. It's that balance and that competition between oligarchs that perhaps makes them a more safe form of government. I'm going to leave the jury out. That's why I asked the question. I don't think there's any one clear answer. I think populists can be really dangerous. I think oligarchs can be really dangerous. But it's clear that in both archaic Athens and Sparta, the governing council was often called upon in times when an individual was getting, as Walter would say, out of check or out of balance. Okay, so I think we've been pretty clear at laying the groundwork for that, and we're now ready to transition to new ideas coming out of Plato. Here's what I'd like to propose to you as today's big idea. If we accept that a governing council has a lot of advantages, and many of you all did in your responses to my first discussion board question, how could we streamline our class with a governing council? Then the ultimate challenge of creating a governing council is the problem of fairness. That's the eternal riddle, right? How do we pick members of a council to ensure that they will be the best leaders, and also that the various members of the population will be fairly represented? I think many of you could imagine a scenario in which our class had created a governing council, but I don't think any of you would have been happy if it had been all Socratics or all oligarchs or even all Democrats, because what you would want is some sort of mixture of interests to balance each other out and preventing anyone from getting too far ahead, except for maybe the Socratics. I think the Socratics would have loved it if their governing council was all Socratics. My apologies. I know I'm going to get some hate mail now from the Socratics. Make your arguments philosophically and I'll be proud. So yes, the big idea I want to get to is one that Plato is deeply interested in, as is Lycurgus in Sparta, which is that nobody in Athens really thinks harder about how to create a fair and just governing council from Plato. So many of his philosophical dialogues are devoted to this question. Plato's obviously not a fan of direct democracy. He obviously thinks mob rule is very dangerous, but he also knows that in order to create a perfect oligarchy, it takes a lot of work to select members. Now, ultimately, Plato, as we will see in the next few minutes, fails in his mission. He himself personally tries to create a perfect society, but will fail in that. And yet, I think the very last work that he ever wrote, the Laws, lays a roadmap, tries to show us the Spartan system as a potential model for how Athenians or other political adherents of Plato's could move forward towards creating a perfect society. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to break this lecture into two parts. I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the life story of Plato and what I mean by the fact that he failed to create a perfect oligarchy. And then I'm going to try to show you some evidence in his laws and connect that to the Lykurgan reading in order to show you what evidence there is that Plato was a fan of the Spartan system or maybe was inspired by the Spartan system. So first Plato, then Sparta. Okay, let's proceed on. Plato's life story. All right, today for class, I asked you to read the Laws by Plato. Now, this work is a little bit sketchy, and what I mean by that is we are not entirely sure that it was actually written by Plato and not by, say, one of Plato's students or disciples later on. If we accept that it was written by Plato, we believe it was perhaps his last work ever written around 348 BCE. Keep in mind, that's about 50 years after the trial of Socrates. Plato would have had to be in his 70s at this point. So if he wrote it, it's a real end-of-life text. It's also, for reasons that I myself am not entirely clear on, considered one of his worst dialogues. It's funny, if you Google Laws, like the first thing that comes up is his latest and most loathsome dialogue. And I was just like, whoa, so much hate on Plato's later works. But I think in some ways it's because it's a little repetitive from the Republic. Socrates is not actually in the Laws, something we'll come back to. So for many reasons, it's a weird little dialogue. But what I want to focus on now is the fact that it's a late dialogue. What did it mean that this is the text that Plato wrote at the end of his life? And how might all of his experiences after Socrates have influenced the composition of the Laws? I'm now going to take you a little bit on a deep dive into Plato's backstory. And I think one cautionary I want to offer you before we take that deep dive is that almost all of the biographical information we have about Plato was not written by him, but written after him. So it is very speculative to know anything for sure about Plato's life after the trial of Socrates, and we need to take everything with a giant grain of salt. But for the purposes of lecture, it's my video, I'm going to just assume that the seventh epistle and some of the Roman historians who write about Plato have their basic outline of their facts straight. So as we look at the Laws, I think this late date is significant because if in fact it's true that Plato tried and failed to create a perfect society, the Laws might be his sort of last instruction manual on how someone after him could do it. And what is the it that Plato tried to do? Well, according to later biographers, Plato didn't just want to talk about Callipolis and the ideal city. He genuinely wanted to create it. He wanted to take Socrates' idea of Callipolis with the guardians and the workers and the auxiliaries and make it come true for real people of his own generation. That's a big dream, a big ask, but there is some historical evidence that Plato, again, wanted to get out of the realm of thought experiment and into the realm of real life. So let me tell you a little bit about how he attempted that. Okay, according to our Roman sources, the trial of Socrates was not only a grief-stricken event for the Socratics, but it was also one that struck in them a little bit of fear. In 399-398 BCE, after the execution of Socrates, Plato and several of other of the Socratics actually fled the city of Athens. Why? We don't have much detail, but presumably we can imagine there was a little bit of hostility towards the Socratic philosophers. And if indeed Socrates was prosecuted because of his affiliation with the 30, even if it was never said out loud, maybe other Socratics also feared that they too would be taken vengeance upon because of this association between Socratic philosophy and the 30. Plato led the other Socratics to the nearby city of Megara, where there was another philosopher practicing. And here they spent about 10 years gathering and trying to pick up the pieces of their lives after the death of their luminary and their leader, Socrates. Again, we don't have hardly any information about what they did there or what they were preparing for, if it was mostly personal consolation time or if they had plans already in mind. But after these about 10, 11 years spent in Megara outside the city of Athens, we know that Plato came back to Athens in an effort to kick a big project off the ground. In 387, Plato inherited from a family member a small chunk of land in the region outside of the walls of Athens called the Hecademia. That was its old archaic name. And in the classical period, it became shortened to Academia, not Hecademia. And this region from ancient descriptions was near a shrine to Athena. It was considered sacred territory to her. It was surrounded by olive groves. And here at this Academia, Plato opened what is known as the first major school in Western civilization. It was a school of advanced thought and philosophy. Now, it was not open to the public from what we can tell. It was not a public school system. They didn't try to train children from youth up. It was an advanced thinking institution for other like-minded philosophers to come to hear Plato lecture, to learn the ideas and the ideals of Socrates. And again, according to our very loose information, this was not a paid venture. You didn't have to pay, you just had to be accepted by Plato and his fellow teachers. This, by the way, is where we get the word the academy or academic. Technically, my job profession is as an academic. It all comes back to all of the idea of the modern university can be traced back to Plato's foundation of the academy as a school for higher thinking. Ironically, it also kind of fulfilled an untruth that appeared in the comic play of Aristophanes. If you can think back to last week's lecture, you'll remember that I said in Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, he imagined that Socrates had a permanent school called the Thinkery. And he didn't, of course. Socrates didn't own land, at least not enough land for a big academy, and didn't offer systematic schooling. But Plato did, right? Plato kind of made that myth in Aristophanes into a truth. So the academy becomes the home base of Plato, and it will survive for hundreds and hundreds of years, well into the Roman Empire. And eventually, especially towards the end of Plato's life, the academy is such a prestigious location that Plato begins to become famous, and smart students from all over the Mediterranean begin to flock to Athens in order to study under him. Ironically, Plato becomes an even greater celebrity than his teacher and is invited to travel to Egypt, to Crete, throughout Greece in order to discuss the life and legacy of Socrates. In those travels, and this is where I'd like to move to my next slide, we believe that at some point, probably in the 370s, 360s, Plato traveled to the island of Sicily. Now, Sicily today is that island right at the bottom of the boot of Italy. It's an Italian territory. Remember in the movie The Godfather? Oh, they'd hate to be remembered for that. There's so much more in Sicily than the mafia, but that's what I think you might know. I'm going to get in trouble. I feel like John is already going to start yelling at me about Italian heritage. But anyway, let me rein it in. In the time of Plato's life, Sicily was actually a Greek territory, Greek-speaking. Remember, the Sicilian expedition was about conquering more Greek land. Anyway, in the 370s, we think that Plato took a trip to Sicily purportedly to go see the scientific phenomena of Mount Etna. But while he was there, he met the king of the biggest polis on the island of Sicily, and that was the city of Syracuse. Of course, the New York state city Syracuse is named after this older, more famous Syracuse. Now, Syracuse was not an oligarchy or a democracy, it was a monarchy. And it was run by a very rich and very powerful king named Dionysius, not to be confused with Dionysus, the god of wine. Dionysius was known as something of a tyrant, an autocrat, but he was also quite intellectually curious. And so for some months, we believe Plato instructed Dionysius in Socratic philosophy. We're not sure, but one running theory is that Plato saw his meeting with Dionysius as an opportunity to create a philosopher king, right? That's what had been at the core of the Republic. One leader with true philosophic virtue who could spread philosophy among his people, right? To promote a perfect society. Unfortunately for Plato, the philosophy of Socrates began to get on the nerves of this king of Syracuse. And the Roman historian Diogenes Laertius tells us that eventually things began to go terribly off the rails for Plato in Sicily. I'm going to read you this passage from his history, book 3. When Plato spoke about tyranny and maintained that the interest of the ruler alone was not the best goal, unless he, meaning the ruler, were also excellent in virtue, he offended Dionysius. In anger, the king exclaimed, "You talk like an old dotard." "And you like a tyrant," responded Plato. At this, the tyrant grew furious, and at first was determined to put Plato to death. But he did not indeed go so far, but handed him over to a Spartan ambassador with orders to sell him into slavery. So this goes really bad, right? Plato is at first gently trying to teach Dionysius that what it means to be a philosopher king is not just to put your own interests first, but that to cultivate virtue and to always put virtue first in your decision making. And Dionysius takes this as a personal criticism that Plato is insulting him. And Dionysius says, "You talk like an old dotard," which, I can't help myself, reminds me of that early controversy between Trump and Kim Jong-un, in which Trump called Kim a rocket man, and then Kim came back in Korean and called him a dotard, which is a really old-fashioned word, but it basically just means like a loony old man or a crazy old man. So Plato calls Dionysius a tyrant, and Dionysius calls Plato a dotard. And this ends up with Plato almost getting executed by a very angry king, and then eventually sold into slavery. Now, again, I have to caution here that this source comes from the Roman period, nearly 600-700 years after Plato lived. It's very hard to know how much of this is precisely true. But we're going to go with it. And according to the same source, Plato got saved from slavery by the skin of his teeth. He was taken to a slave market in Egina, but one of his rich friends saw him on the selling block and spent a fortune to buy him right away and give him his freedom back before anybody else could buy Plato and take advantage of him. Can you imagine being from one of the most aristocratic families in all of Greece, having studied under the great philosopher Socrates, owning your own school, and then just because of the whims of one angry king, having the rug ripped right out from under you and being made a slave in the snap of his fingers, right? What I find amazing about all of this is that despite the fact that he underwent so many dangers, Plato did not immediately give up on his dreams. Now, he knew that he could not go back to the same king of Sicily because obviously things hadn't gone well the first time. But Plato bided his time in Athens, and when King Dionysius I eventually died on the throne, his son Dionysius II replaced him. And Plato made a second and also a third trip to Sicily in order to introduce himself to the new king, Dionysius II. And there he really tried, he was a little bit more careful. He tried to convince Dionysius II to give him land and funding to create his own philosophical city in Sicily. Now, again, the grain of salt reminder, I'm sorry I keep, hammering you, but if this is true, big if, this might be evidence that, again, Plato wanted to desperately realize in reality the dream of Socrates of how you could experimentally create an ideal city. Unfortunately for Plato, this second and third time to try to convince a Sicilian king to support the philosophical mission did not work. Plato came to Dionysius II and said, "Look, O king, you have a great opportunity. Your father squandered it." And according to the histories, at first Dionysius II seemed amenable to the idea. He even promised to set aside some land on the island for Plato. But eventually, just like his father, Dionysius II got increasingly annoyed with Plato and warned him, "You'd better leave Sicily permanently, or else you're going to leave in a body bag, right? You're not going to walk out of here unchained or even alive if you continue to annoy me and press me with this crazy philosophical mission." According to Diogenes Laertius, Plato's failure with Dionysius II, like father, like son, was his last attempt to ever intervene in politics again. Plato returned to Athens, he returned to the academy, and he spent the rest of his life trying to teach the core principles that Socrates had spoken about in the Republic, the dream of creating a Callipolis, a truly noble city. For all intents and purposes, though, I think Plato came to terms with the fact that the idea of Callipolis was dead, at least in his generation, that he would never have the opportunity to realize in the Greek world the notion of a perfect oligarchy that Socrates had discussed with the guardians and the auxiliaries. To wrap up the story of Plato, therefore, I hope that understanding this lifetime of trying and failing, of trying to take the words on the page and make them reality, is the historical contextual backdrop in which we might want to consider approaching the laws. Again, if any of this is in fact true. But I will say that despite all the speculativeness behind both Plato's backstory and the question of whether or not Plato even wrote the laws himself, there does seem to be some evidence that the laws is one last stand for Socratic philosophy and an attempt to leave very clear instructions, really specific instructions, about how you could create a perfect city with a perfect council. So we're going to now wrap up Platonic backstory, and we're going to switch to the laws. And I want to start by telling you some of the reasons why the laws are a little bit different. If you'd like to pull up the laws on perusal, or if you'd like to pull up my PowerPoint slides so you can look at the passages more clearly, feel free to do so. Put me on pause, and whenever you're ready, start again. Okay, good. Pausing on video form is weird. Okay, laws it is. Why do I think that the laws might be something of a final roadmap? Well, first of all, and this is super unusual, the dialogue in the laws, it still is a dialogue. It's a conversation between three participants. But you're going to notice right away that Socrates is not one of them. Why did Plato leave Socrates out? I really have no idea. But one potential theory is that Plato knew Socrates was somewhat alienating and wanted to make it perhaps more accessible. So he creates fictional characters instead of real ones. Now, in this dialogue, among all these fictional characters, he has three members. There is a figure called the Spartan, or the Lacedaemonian, which is just another fancy word for Spartan. There's the Athenian, and neither of these characters are actually given a name. They're just kind of like if you said the Venezuelan, or the Portuguese, or the Italian. They're just given names based on their nationality. And then you do have one figure who gets a name, and that figure is Cleinias. Cleinias is a Cretan from the island of Crete, just below mainland Greece. And in this dialogue, at the end of Book 3 of the Laws, Cleinias reveals that he has a mission. He has to found a new colony, a new city under the aegis of the major city, Knossos. And so he asks advice from both the Spartan and the Athenian about what they would do if they had to start a city from scratch. How would you create an ideal city? So you can already see there's some parallels here with the Republic, right? The Republic was all about creating an ideal city, a fictional Callipolis. The Laws is slightly more historicized in that Cleinias is a Cretan. Crete is a real place. Knossos is a real place. But the advice that the Athenian and the Spartan are going to give to Cleinias is remarkably similar to the main advice that is laid out in the Republic. What I'd now like to do is take a couple of minutes and deep dive into a handful of passages from the Laws. And what I want to highlight for you here is just how exactingly specific Plato is getting in his advice about how to create a perfect governing council, right? What it takes to have a perfect oligarchy. And the level of detail here is even more specific than in the Republic, which again makes me wonder, is this like Plato's cookbook for a perfect oligarchy? Okay, let's start with first two passages. The one is about exactly how long guardians should serve, and then we'll move on to generals. Okay. So in this passage of the Laws, we again see the word guardians come up. And in the Laws, Plato has the Athenian recommend to Cleinias that his city should be governed by 37 guardians. Where does that number come from? I'm not sure, and I confess I don't know enough about the Laws to know all the deep scholarship on why. But it sure does sound a lot like 30 tyrants, doesn't it? Or maybe 30 members of the Gerousia. I don't think that's an accident. Now, according to Plato's Laws, as for the members of our 37, both in the first instance and forever after the future, let these be the responsibilities for which they were chosen. Let them be guardians in the first place of the laws, and in the second place of the written returns which each person makes, i.e., how much money do they make. So, just as for Socrates in the Republic, for Plato in the Laws, the purpose of the guardians is to create the laws and protect them. So they themselves hold almost complete oligarchic power over legislation. And then furthermore, Plato is really interested in putting a sort of age limit and term limits on these guardians within his laws. A guardian of the law shall not hold office for more than 20 years, and he shall enter upon the office when he is not less than 50 years. If he takes up the office at 60, then he only gets to have it for 10 years. Just because someone lives past the age of 70, he can't expect to keep his power, right? Now, this, of course, your little alarm bell should be going off in your head that, gosh, this sounds an awful lot like the Spartan Gerousia, right? The Council of the Elders, in which you have to be aged and wise in order to enter. And then, interestingly, Plato isn't giving them a lifelong appointment. He's making sure that no one of a senile mind is going to be able to continue to be a guardian past the age of their mind's sharpness. Plato gets even more specific still when he gets down into the next tier of leadership positions, and he describes how the Athenians should select their generals through a process that is, on the one hand, somewhat democratic, but also very much in the hands of the governing council of these 37 guardians. According to Plato, in the perfect Cretan city, the generals should be nominated by the guardians, right? So the guardians get to make the ultimate nomination for who should be a candidate to become a leading general. And in order to be even a candidate, by all those who in their younger days have served in wartime, who at any particular time are still at an age for service. So the nominees for the generalships have to be military experts in and of their own right. But then interestingly, a little bit further down, he says that that ultimately it's the candidates themselves who are the ones who get to choose which is to be the general, right? Whichever is preferred on a show of hands, let him be included in a list of candidates. The three who get the most support on a show of hands, these are to be generals and to be given responsibility for military affairs, and let them be vetted in the same way as the guardians of the law. So Plato cleverly, I think, puts the selection in the hands of the Council of Elders, or the 37 guardians, but he lets the candidates themselves pick the three amongst them, kind of like the way the cardinals get to select amongst themselves who is going to be their new pope. But you can already see the standards are very high. Plato is not even going to mess with really public elections or lottery, picking names out of hats, not in his ideal city. Selection of leaders is a very streamlined process based on expertise. Now, the last two passages I want to look at in Plato's laws have to do with the concept of equality. Because remember where I started this lecture. I emphasized that for Plato, he's really trying to think carefully about how do you create a council that is fair and just, right? That truly does the best thing by the most people. Not just who has the most money or who has the most war horses. It has to be on the basis of true representation and equality. At the end of the laws of our passage that we read are perhaps two of the most significant passages. So if you kind of skimmed it and skipped the last page, go back because you don't want to miss this. At the end of the laws, the section that we read, Plato says basically that there are two types of equality and that we can't overlook and make a mistake about which one is more important. The first type of equality that Plato describes is the equality of man. The equality, as I'm going to read it here, first is the equality of measurement, weights, and number. And applying it to the distribution of public honors is within the capacity of any city or any lawgiver. They can use the drawing of lots to ensure equality. The truest and best equality is not immediately obvious to everybody. This passage is really important because just take a minute and think, drawing of lots, who does that remind you of? What city is the city that draws lots to ensure equality? What city is the city that is so obsessed with equality of outcome, meaning everybody gets ultimately the same turn to participate in government? Plato here is clearly talking about Athens. The equality of man, meaning the equality that human beings have designed, is this notion of like an elementary school birthday party where every kid wants the exact same size slice of cake, no matter how big they are or how hungry they are. If you've ever supervised young children, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Everybody has to have an equal number of jelly beans, a number of equal turns down the slide. Equality of man, right? This very human notion of I want the same as what my neighbor has. And Plato is clearly hinting to us through this passage that this is what Athens is so obsessed with, equality of outcome. Everybody gets the same, nobody is higher than the other, and in order to ensure that, we pick by lottery system. But then, curiously, Plato turns in the laws to say there's another type of equality though, and it's the equality of the gods. More specifically in this passage, he says it's the equality of Zeus. And we only see it in a few instances. But when the gods are trying to mete out justice, they don't give everybody the same slice of birthday cake. No, they give us the slice of birthday cake that we deserve. So take a look at this passage. This type of equality leaves the decision to Zeus, and its effect on mankind is always the same. It helps human beings rarely, though whenever it does help either cities or individuals, it is the cause of all things good, since it allocates more to what is greater and less to what is lesser, and by giving each of them a measure related to its nature. Let me pause there and just let that sink in. When Zeus doles out benefits, Plato is saying, he gives more benefits to the cities and to the people who are great, and he gives fewer benefits to the cities and the people who are less great. It's a method of equality based on deserving rather than numeric equality or measured equality. Okay, to get back to the passage. In the case of public honors, greater honors to those whose endowment of human goodness is greater, and lesser honors to those whose endowment of goodness and education is the opposite, duly allocates to each class what is appropriate to it. This should be making you think of the Republic, where Socrates espouses a sort of theory that each human being is made for a specific task or specific virtue. That let the shoemaker be the shoemaker, let the potter be the potter, let the guardian be the guardian, let the soldier be the soldier. And this fits into that notion by essentially saying that whatever degree of goodness and education and virtue you cultivate in yourself, when the God doles out benefits, that's what he's taking into account. And if we want to build a truly perfect city, we have to make our government closer to the equality of the gods than the equality of man. Now, what do you want to call this? Would you call this a meritocracy? The notion that we promote the people who deserve it the most? Or is it more of an aristocracy? Like we go and we try to hunt out the very best people and we just promote them by virtue of being the best. Plato doesn't fully define, like, how do you measure goodness? How do you measure virtue, right? These are very tricky things to quantify. But ultimately, in principle, he truly believes that the only way a city can achieve justice and harmony is by elevating and honoring with public office those who have truly merited it and have merited it in such a way that is recognized by all their peers. Now, I'd like to wrap up this lecture in about the next 10 minutes, but I want to shift now to Sparta because I also asked you to read a little bit about Sparta. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that even though Plato doesn't come out and say it in the laws, the government that I think he very much has in mind is the ideal Spartan system as envisioned by the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus. You might need a little bit of a brain refresher here. We talked about Lycurgus way back in week 4, and if you want to go back, it slides class 4.1. And in that lecture, I talked about how Lycurgus, that's this guy here in the cloud, was a semi-mythical lawgiver of Sparta who consulted with the oracle and then created the Spartan system, the constitution, the great Ratra. Now, Plato and Lycurgus lived centuries apart. That's even if Lycurgus was a real person. But Plato definitely would have known all about Lycurgus, and it's one of the reasons why he makes one of the characters in the laws a Spartan, and that Spartan talks about the Spartan system of government as created by Lycurgus. So what I want to drive at is when we think about Plato's ideal of a city that rewards people for their comparative merit, for how good they are, that he might have had in mind the very Spartan system of government, which is all about rewarding the best and punishing the worst. Let me show you a few examples. The examples I'm going to share with you come from the second reading I asked you to do last night, which is from an author named Plutarch the biographer. I love Plutarch. He's in a lot of my research. Now, again, as always, a caveat, Plutarch lived like 800 years after Lycurgus. Again, that's even if Lycurgus was real. So we have to take everything that Plutarch says with a really big, giant pillar of salt. And we also have to recognize that by the time Plutarch was living in Rome, Sparta had already been super mythologized. So their ideas of Sparta were kind of as superheroes, the way we think of Spartans. Nonetheless, Plutarch's biography of Lycurgus is perhaps the most detailed description of the ideal system that Lycurgus tried to set in place for his Spartan people. And it's basically where all of our evidence comes from. If you like the movie The 300 or any of the comics about Sparta, almost every detail we think we know about Spartan society largely comes from Plutarch. So, within this reading, which was definitely longer than the Plato reading, you should have noticed many familiar things that I already taught you about way back in week 4. For example, Plutarch gives you just a lot more detail about the really hardcore agoge system. He's the one who gives us the story about the kid with the fox in his cloak. That's this little picture here who doesn't want to squirm while he's in the battle formation, so he lets the fox eat through his guts. Almost certainly that's a made-up story, but whatever. It's illustrative of Spartan badassery. It is from Plutarch that we learn so much about the fact that the Spartan political body is essentially the Spartan military body, and that you can't be a member of the demos without being a full-fledged member of the military. It's also where we get our information about Spartan women. And I gotta tell you, every time I read the life of Lycurgus, there's a new detail that jumps out at me. And this time it was the fact that when Spartan women get married, they get their heads shaved. And I just thought, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that's a very Spartan thing to do. Good Lord. So all of that information is juicy detail about Sparta. But what I really want to draw your attention to as you read over this text is to know all the ways in which Plutarch seems to be communicating that the Spartan political system and education system and culture is all about, it is completely designed around this idea of equality as meritocracy. Spartans don't all get the same slice of birthday cake like they do in Athens. Everybody gets exactly what they deserve if they're lucky, right? If you are really bad, you are guaranteed to get beaten and punished. If you're really good, you maybe will be lucky enough to win recognition and honor among your people. So this is where I suspect Plato is getting his principle of an equality of the gods. And there's a couple of passages in the reading I want to zoom in on, and you can definitely use in a future research paper if you decide to write about this week on the governing council. For example, take a look at this passage from Plutarch about the role that young Spartan girls played in correcting and criticizing young Spartan men. Boy, you thought your playground was rough. The girls would make fun of each of the young men, helpfully criticizing their mistakes. On other occasions, they would rehearse in song the praises which they had composed about those meriting them, so that they filled the youngsters with a great sense of ambition and rivalry. The one who was praised for his manliness became a celebrated figure to the girls and went off priding himself. So even from youth, Spartan young women are clearly being trained to mock the boys who are not effective and to praise the boys who are very successful in the agoge. Like I said, a rough couple kindergarten years. It's ingrained from childhood. In another passage, we learn about how boys a little bit older in age were taught the art of criticism and critiquing. In this passage, we learn about the Aaron, who's one of the guardians over the youngest class of men. He would tell one boy to sing, while to another he would pose a question which called for a reply, like, "Who among the men is best, and what is your opinion of so-and-so's action?" Thereby, boys grew accustomed to judging excellence and to making a critical appraisal of the citizens right from the start. This is wild, right? Young Spartan boys are going to school, and the school curriculum that they are learning is how to criticize their elders. Back to the passage. When asked which citizen was good or whose reputation was low, the boy who proved to be at a loss for an answer was regarded as a sluggard. And if you got the answer wrong, if you look at the bottom of the passage, the Aaron bites your thumb really hard, right? So, I don't know, I feel like at most universities or even high schools, it would be considered really rude to criticize your teachers or the other elders around you. You're supposed to be respectful of your elders. Yes, in Sparta, you don't be disrespectful, but they're training young men to openly criticize their elders and to learn what good behavior is. In another passage from the life of Lycurgus, we learn that the most popular music in Sparta was about celebrating heroes and condemning cowards. They were praises applauding the good fortune of those who had died for Sparta. They condemned the cowards whose lives were filled with grief and misery. Promises to be brave, boasts about bravery, and there's even a choir of old men who sing about the good old days when they themselves were brave, right? Can you imagine an entire cultural system where song and theater and dance is all about celebrating good individuals and putting down bad individuals? If you'd had like a bad uncle in your family line who dropped his shield, you might hear about him in songs for generations, right? This is again what Plato had in mind about a culture entirely built around judging people, ranking people. The very last passage I want to share with you is about how the Spartans picked the members of their Gerousia council. Now, you might think the Gerousia Council, it's the Council of Elders. By this point, the competition would be over, right? You've reached the end of your life. But according to Plutarch, not at all. Even when you're in your 50s and 60s, you have to compete to be invited to join the Council of the Elders. This is a long passage. I'm not going to read all of it, but I want to hit the highlights. When it comes to getting into the Gerousia, because these are old men, as the beginning of the passage tells you, it's not about who's fastest or strongest. It's about who's the best and the wisest. And the selection is made in the following way. The chosen candidates are all put in a building, and then they're led out one by one into the assembly of Spartiate citizens. As each man comes before them, the crowd essentially shouts really, really loud. And I'm going to jump down to the end. Whoever was met with the most shouting and the loudest was the man declared elected. Now, there's a passage in Aristotle where he says that this is literally the stupidest way to pick a leader, right? By shouting really loud. But again, I think it illustrates this ingrained notion at Sparta that at every phase of your life, you're being judged, you're being ranked by your peers, and that criticism is forthcoming if in any way you have fallen short of the Spartan ideal. And so again, I think of Plato writing in his laws about a government system which selects elders, 37 of them, and allows them to serve only for a fixed period of 20 years when they're at their wisest. I have a hard time believing that that picture he has in his head of a perfect governing council isn't in some way connected to the description of the Gerousia in that we get in the life of Lycurgus, right? That they're based on a similar model. So I'd like to wrap up here by emphasizing the big takeaway. And my big takeaway for the day is this, that Plato and the Spartans seem to agree. If you want the best government, the best community, the best leaders, you have to build a society that is entirely obsessed with ranking, with judgment, with critique, with seeking out the best, and not simply giving everybody an equal share. Quality for these guys does not mean that everybody gets an equal slice of the pie. It means that you get what you deserve, even if that is completely antithetical from the political ideology of Athens. Now, the important part of my lecture is done, but I know I've got quite a few of you who are either business majors or thinking about entrepreneurship in some way. And so I'd like to point you in the direction of a couple business leaders and thinkers who, whether they know it or not, are drawing upon these Platonic and Spartan ideas, in the sense that they are arguing that the best businesses, the most successful ones, are those that are radical, or they call it radical transparency or radically candid about criticism. Within the past couple of years, there was a book called Radical Candor published. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's all about how to be really upfront with people, criticizing them, ranking them without losing all of your humanity. And then really famously, Ray Dalio, who's the head of Bridgewater Associates, a major hedge fund firm, he writes in his book Principles about how he completely organized Bridgewater around ranking and criticism. And even he, when he gives a presentation to his board or to his lower level employees, he asks for their criticism and to be ranked. And he talks in this book about a great moment when one of the lowest ranking employees sent him an email that said, "Your presentation was terrible. You didn't prepare at all. It was very clear that you were fumbling with your notes." Can you imagine doing that to your professor, right? That kind of radical, transparent criticism. But I think Plato and the Spartans would be all about it, because how else do you identify who deserves to be at the top, other than by saying it out loud and be really clear about what models of good behavior you're looking for? I have a bad feeling all of this is going to show up on my teaching evaluations. I don't know if I want your radical candidacy at the candor at the end of my semester, but whatever you decide, have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Adios.